What's up, y'all? Welcome to another episode of Critical Consciousness. Today we're going to be talking about a really important political concept, critical consciousness, which obviously inspired the name of this channel. And it's also just a really important political concept in radical political theory in general. So without further ado, let's get into it. So what does it mean to have a critical consciousness? The term comes from Marxist Brazilian scholar Paolo Freire's 3 stages of consciousness: magical consciousness, naive consciousness, and critical consciousness. At the magical stage of consciousness, which is the first stage, social phenomena or social issues like poverty, inequality, racism, etc., are attributed to luck, fate, or God. For example, someone with a magical consciousness might say something like, "Poor people are people that God is punishing from a past life," or something like that. Or God didn't intend for women to be astute business people, or something like that. Now, of course, these types of explanations are ridiculous, and in large part, very few people living in the year 2026 operate at a magical stage of consciousness, although it still permeates many people's thinking in various ways. At the naive stage of consciousness, social phenomena like poverty, inequality, racism, etc., is attributed to individual action or individual choice or character. So, for example, someone with a naive consciousness might say something like, "Poor people are poor because they're lazy," right? Which is something that we still hear quite a bit. In the context of education, we might hear something like, "Black students don't perform as well on standardized tests because they don't care about education or because they're inherently less intelligent," right? The naive stage of consciousness implies there's some flaw of the individual or community, a wrong choice that someone made, or a lack of character. Now, as a society, I would argue we still very much exist at the naive stage of consciousness. And while many of us can acknowledge something like, not everyone who's homeless it's because they're lazy, right? I would argue the insidiousness of naive consciousness still permeates our thinking in so many ways. And later on in this video, I'm going to offer some very nuanced and important examples to help us identify this pattern in our thinking and how it ultimately serves to uphold structures of power, right? To keep them in place. And finally, at the critical stage of consciousness, which is where we want to get to as human beings and as a society, social phenomena or social issues like poverty, inequality, racism, etc., are attributed to intentionally designed systems and structures of power. In other words, at the critical stage of consciousness, we use systemic explanations for social problems. So to use some of the same examples as the previous two, someone with a critical consciousness would say something like, "Capitalism requires poverty to ensure a large pool of cheap, competing laborers." Or, "Women are underrepresented in the world of business due to historical patriarchal structures which insisted that a woman's role in society was strictly child rearing and domestic labor." And you might be thinking, so critical consciousness is basically just the explanation that sounds the most intelligent. And it's a little more complicated than that, to be fair. So we have these 3 stages of consciousness as outlined by Paolo Freire, right? Magical consciousness, naive consciousness, and critical consciousness. Now, I'm going to spend some time focusing on the naive stage of consciousness because this is largely where we are as a society today. Many people are still stuck in these patterns of thought which posit that individuals and their individual actions are to blame for their problems or, moreover, for problems in society. And this kind of thinking is incredibly insidious and permeates so many aspects of our lives, and it really shows up not just in our social explanations, but also in how we treat each other, and even more profoundly, in how we treat ourselves. And this is no coincidence. In fact, it's by design. The status quo, the structures of power, the wealthiest, most powerful people in the world, their power and their higher status relies on the majority of us operating at a naive level of consciousness. That is to say, if the majority of us broke out of this naive consciousness and evolved our thinking to the critical stage, the people in power would effectively lose their power. So it's important they keep us sort of stuck at the naive stage of consciousness. And as far as how naive consciousness manifests within the people around us, within ourselves, and especially within our political analysis, I'm going to discuss 4 different levels. At the most basic level, if we think, for example, oh, poor people are poor because they're lazy, that explanation allows us to kind of bypass the deeper root cause reason behind why someone might be sleeping on the streets, for example, right? There's nothing wrong with the system. No. Don't question that, right? It's that person's fault, right? That's why they're in that position, because of something that they did, some choices that they made, right? It's their individual fault. And this is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of upholding the structure of power because, well, if it's that person's fault, then I don't need to do anything about it, right? There's nothing I can do about it. At an interpersonal level, naive consciousness can manifest as, oh, I'm better or smarter than these other people, or I made better individual choices, therefore I deserve to have this status in society. Or oftentimes it might look like telling someone else, like, you should stop being so lazy, or you need to do this, right? Kind of imposing what you think another person should do with their life. At an internalized level, it can look like shaming ourselves for being lazy, for not living life like this other person, right? Oftentimes it manifests as a kind of self-deprecating internal dialogue that convinces us we're never enough, that we could be or should be doing more, right? And in terms of how this benefits people in power, well, if you have a bunch of humans in a society who never feel like they're enough and who effectively blame themselves for their own hardships, they're going to be much more likely to accept their own subordination, right? Their own mistreatment, if you will, because, well, they deserve it, right? It's my fault anyway. And finally, one of the most effective ways that naive consciousness manifests and serves the interests of the ruling elite is through the subtle manipulation of our political analysis. For example, when we see an instance of police brutality, many people are inclined to blame the individual cop or police officer, right? He was a racist, and that's why that happened, right? That's sort of the explanation for why that happened. Or people might say something like, not all cops are bad people, right? I know some good cops personally. And here's the thing about naive consciousness, okay? It's not to say the cop who committed a fatal act of police brutality wasn't a racist, right? In fact, he probably was a racist in most cases. And it's not to say that there are no people who work as cops who don't have any redeemable qualities, right? But the thing about naive consciousness is it's not about the cops as individuals, whether this cop is good or bad. It's about the institution of policing in the United States and the way that it was structurally established to protect property, which, remember, at one point involved enslaved human beings. That's the critical consciousness, right? Transcending this tendency to get caught up in the individual actors and instead focusing on the systems themselves. That's what it means to have a critical consciousness. When people are stuck in the naive stage, the underlying structure, the root cause, is allowed to continue. It's never fully addressed, which is why we continue to see fatal incidents of police brutality in the US committed disproportionately against people of color. This is one example in the context of police brutality by which naive consciousness subtly manipulates our political analysis. And to provide an even more sophisticated example in the context of geopolitics, I'm going to display this exchange I saw on Reddit and use it as kind of a reference. And there's so much to unpack in just this small exchange, but let's get into it here. This person is replying to something someone said, which we can't see. They say, quote, Israel does not control the economy. Capitalists and imperialists control the economy, right? So this person is trying to encourage a critical consciousness and say, no, Israel, this individual country, doesn't control the whole economy, right? All of these issues are not strictly because of Israel, right? They're structural. They're the result of capitalism and imperialism, which are systems. And the person essentially doubles down in their reply by saying, no, Israel controls the economy, right? They're shifting the attention away from the systems of capitalism and imperialism and back onto the individual actor, which in this case is Israel, exhibiting a classic example of naive consciousness. And here's the thing, once again, about naive consciousness, right? It's not to say Israel isn't a problem, that AIPAC, the tremendous political, financial influence that Zionism carries, it's not to say this isn't a problem, right? But it's not about Israel as an individual actor. It's not about some lone rogue state or crazy leader, right? It's about the systems of capitalism and imperialism which necessitate wars and genocides to continue extracting capital from the global south. If it wasn't Israel, it would just be someone else or some other state or nation, because it's not about the individual actors, it's about the underpinning systems and structures. And the craziest part about this exchange, in which will really demonstrate how naive consciousness is intended to manipulate the masses and confuse us, the person responds by basically calling out the fact that this is a bot account, right? They say 209,000 karma on a 3-month-old account, right? Which is literally impossible, right? For folks who may not be familiar with Reddit, karma is basically like if someone likes a comment that you put. So basically 209,000 times this person's comments have been liked within a span of 3 months, right? That's literally impossible. For reference, I've had a Reddit account for over a decade, and I think I'm at like 40,000 karma or something like that. So this is quite clearly a bot account that's sort of perpetuating Israel controls the economy. This person continues by saying defends capitalism and imperialism by attempting to shift blame onto Israel. COINTELPRO vibes off the charts, not gonna lie. Also, no, Israel does not control the economy. My previous comment stands. And this really shows us what's at stake here. Where do bot accounts like this come from? Well, it's probably not working class people like you and I playing silly games on the computer, right? These types of accounts are created en masse and paid for by people in positions of power, by the structures of power, by the wealthy. It's a psychological operation that's funded and designed to confuse people. So here we have this bot account with the edgy name AIPAC Hemorrhoid, which also just shows how sophisticated this kind of Psyops is. The bot account is attempting to perpetuate naive consciousness among the public, saying, no, focus your attention on Israel, right? This individual actor. Don't talk about the systems of capitalism and imperialism, right? And in doing so, preventing people from possessing a critical consciousness. These bots are essentially designed to sow confusion among the masses and to make us continue blaming individuals rather than focusing our attention on the underlying systems, which are actually responsible for society's problems. Now, this person says COINTELPRO vibes off the charts, not gonna lie. And many of us may already be familiar with what COINTELPRO was, but just to kind of tie this all together, COINTELPRO was a covert FBI operation conducted between 1956 and 1971. The aim of the operation was to infiltrate, disrupt, and discredit radical political movements in the United States, right? Movements that were operating with a critical consciousness, focusing on the root causes of social issues. And the most famous radical political organization that COINTELPRO targeted was the Black Panther Party, which was addressing the issues facing Black communities in the United States at the root cause. Okay, the Black Panther Party wasn't campaigning for any particular presidential candidate. No, they were all about self-determination. Black folks lack access to food. Okay, well then we're going to provide food to our communities. Black folks lack access to education. Okay, well we're going to provide education to our communities. Black folks are being targeted by lynch mobs and the police. Well, we're going to defend ourselves by arming ourselves in our communities. And the Black Panthers had a very sharp critical consciousness, and they were educating their communities accordingly. I'm going to show a clip from Chicago Black Panther Party Chairman Fred Hampton to demonstrate what I'm talking about here.
That's saying that no matter what color you are, there's only two classes. And that's saying there's a class over here and there's a class over there. And the reason that this class over here has never did anything to get this class off its back, because this is lower, this is upper, this is the oppressed, this is the oppressor, this is the exploited, this is the exploiter. And these people in this class have divided themselves. They say, I'm black and I hate white people. I'm white and I hate black people. I'm Latin American and I hate hillbillies. I'm hillbilly and I hate Indians. So we fighting amongst each other. And you've heard the testimony of pigs here. You got pigs of all colors, you know that. You got pigs that are white, you got pigs that are black, you even got pigs that are black and white. Propagating the same type of madness that this buffoon Hanrahan would be propagating if he were here himself. And why? Because they want to keep you to believing that I'm your enemy, and that everybody else that's black and that wears a lot of hair on his head and hair on his face, they want to keep you thinking that he's your enemy. Why? Because if ever you would disregard him and overlook him just for a minute and throw away that question of racism and start into dealing with a little logic, then there would be no one else you could attack other than Hanrahan, other than Davy, and other than Tricky Dicky Nixon.
So he says a lot of really interesting things there. And when we're talking about the distinction between a naive consciousness focusing on individuals and a critical consciousness focusing on systems, the concept of racism itself plays a fundamental role. As he says there, I'm white and I hate black people. I'm black and I hate hillbillies. I'm hillbilly and I hate Indians. So we're fighting amongst each other, right? And in many ways, the whole purpose of racism is to perpetuate a naive consciousness, to keep us blaming each other, blaming individuals and communities. No, it's their fault. No, it's their fault, right? Pointing the finger over here, pointing the finger over here, instead of focusing on the underlying systems, right? It's essentially a distraction. And the Black Panthers had figured this out, and they were encouraging others to do the same, which is what made them so dangerous from the perspective of the structures of power. And the ruling elite knew organizations like the Black Panther Party represented a serious threat to their power, which is why the FBI developed covert operations such as COINTELPRO to effectively destroy the Black Panthers and neutralize them as a threat. And just how exactly did COINTELPRO go about disrupting the Black Panthers? Well, they used a variety of tactics that were intended to essentially knock them down from a critical stage of consciousness back to a naive stage of consciousness. They used tactics that were intended to divide leaders and people within the party, creating the conditions for them to resume blaming and fighting each other instead of unifying and fighting the structures of power. And I'm going to read from the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Activities, which conducted an investigation into COINTELPRO and its activities. So this is an official government document, right? Straight from the horse's mouth. Quote, although the claimed purpose of the Bureau's COINTELPRO tactics was to prevent violence, some of the FBI's tactics against the Black Panther Party were clearly intended to foster violence, and many others could reasonably have been expected to cause violence. For example, the FBI's efforts to, quote, intensify the degree of animosity between the Black Panthers and the Blackstone Rangers, a Chicago street gang, included sending an anonymous letter to the gang's leader, falsely informing him that the Chicago Panthers had a hit out on him. The stated intent of the letter was to induce the Ranger leader to take reprisals against the Panther leadership, right? So the FBI was fabricating these letters, sending them to, in this case, the leader of a gang in Chicago, claiming that the Black Panthers were going to kill one of their leaders, right? So this effectively started a gang war between the Black Panthers and the Blackstone Rangers, who were previously working together, right? So they're basically just stirring shit up, right? Similarly, in Southern California, the FBI launched a covert effort to, quote, create further dissension in the ranks of the Black Panther Party. This effort included mailing anonymous letters and caricatures to Black Panther Party members, ridiculing the local and national Black Panther Party leadership for the express purpose of exacerbating an existing gang war between the Black Panther Party and an organization called the United Slaves. This gang war resulted in the killing of 4 Black Panther Party members by members of the United Slaves and in numerous beatings and shootings, right? So this gives us an idea as to the tactics used by the FBI to destroy the Black Panther Party and create division within it. And perhaps most interestingly is the FBI through COINTELPRO didn't really have to take any active measures to destroy the party, right? They just had to create the conditions for the party to destroy itself, which is exactly the type of role that naive consciousness plays in society. The ruling class doesn't have to physically destroy our political movements, at least not right now, because we already do it to ourselves through petty disagreements and our focus on individual actions or just individualism in general. That's why this guy was like COINTELPRO vibes off the charts, not gonna lie, right? He's kind of highlighting the parallels between what's going on here. These types of psychological operations on the part of the power structure are very much alive and well, and they're still manipulating our consciousness. Now, something else that Fred Hampton mentions in his speech in that video is he says something like, you have pigs of the black, pigs of the white, pigs that are black and white. He's obviously referring to police officers here. And what he's saying is it doesn't matter what color or race the police officer is, right? Again, it's not about the individuals. It's about the system, the structure, the institution of police and what it's designed to do, which is protect the ruling elite, to protect the structures of power. And we still hear this kind of thing a lot these days, right? People really believe that the solution to police brutality in the United States is to hire more cops of color. Or even more commonly, we hear this kind of, cops need more anti-racist trainings, or they need more de-escalation trainings, right? Which ironically just funnels more money into the police instead of into our communities. This goes to show just how pervasive naive consciousness continues to be and how successful it continues to be in terms of deflecting our attention away from the underlying structures of power, capitalism, white supremacy, imperialism, patriarchy, etc., and putting our attention onto individual actors, right? Why is police brutality a thing? Well, we have too many white racist cops. Why is there a genocide happening in Palestine? Well, Israel and Netanyahu are these crazy rogue actors. Why is the United States descending into chaos? Well, because Donald Trump is this corrupt man who's ruining democracy, right? And again, it's not to say there is no truth to some of these notions, but it's not about the individual actors. And until we understand this, we're going to keep chasing our tails as a society. We'll continue to see inequality become worse. We'll continue to see more wars and genocides. We'll continue to see fatal incidents of police brutality. And we'll continue to see a lack of action as it relates to climate change. Because so long as we're not focusing on the systems of power, we'll continue to exist in a state of sort of manufactured confusion at the naive stage of consciousness, which is exactly where the ruling elite wants us to be. They want us to be confused so that we can't really do anything to challenge them. The sooner we evolve our consciousness to a critical one, the sooner we can begin to tackle social issues at their root cause, the sooner we'll actually be able to dismantle these colonial structures of power that are the cause of most of our social problems and most of our day-to-day problems as individuals. Thank you very much for tuning in to Critical Consciousness today, y'all. If you like this episode, please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button down below. I'll be back again soon with another one. Take it easy.